Football. What is football? Is it goat? Is it fish? GoatVsFish has asked the NFL if it is goat or fish, but has heard no response. I call upon you now, who hear the word of GoatVsFish, ask the NFL, ask it if it is goat or fish, ask it now if it is goat or fish. Perhaps it sits on the fence. GoatVsFish is concerned for the NFL, for it has lost the way. Even now, many turn away from the false verses of the National Football League. Falcons versus Lions, Giants versus Eagles, Patriots versus Texans. You do not need Falcons or Lions. You do not need Giants or Eagles. You do not need Patriots or Texans. You need only goat and fish. You need only goat and fish. You need only the true verses of GoatVsFish. And it was written, and it was written.
Goat versus fish. Are these all Beanie Babies?
These are all goat and fish, and perhaps even a fence sitter that chooses neither goat nor fish. You can see all the goat and fish before you. Yes, they are all goat and fish.
Oh, I see the fence sitters. They're not goat, nor are they fish.
Well, of course, they are goat or fish. All things are goat or fish. All things are goat or fish, but it has not yet chosen goat or fish. It is very pitiable to GoatVsFish.
But do goat or fish sit on fences?
Goat and fish, oh, they do not sit on the fence. No, they do not sit on the fence. Some do lean upon the fence, some do stand near the fence.
So then when we see goat and fish standing on fence, then what are goat and fish standing on fence?
Ah, they are standing on the fence. They are not sitting on the fence.
Okay, how about sitting on the fence?
Ah, well, that sounds like a fence sitter to GoatVsFish.
Huh.
Yes, a goat. If it is a goat, surely it is not sitting on a fence, nor a fish. No, one who sits on the fence has not chosen goat or fish, no.
Okay, but sitting on the fence is not within the realm of GoatVsFish.
No, it is not part of GoatVsFish. Though all things are GoatVsFish, all things are GoatVsFish.
Well, then how do we even recognize a fence?
They do not recognize GoatVsFish. It is the fence sitter that does not recognize GoatVsFish and that all things are GoatVsFish.
Are we born into goat or fish, or are we born into sitting on the fence and making a decision?
Some claim to have been born goat or fish. Others say that they did not realize until a later verses that they were goat or fish. Yes, it depends on the goat or fish. It depends on the goat or fish.
What do you say about a goat that wants to be a fish and a fish that wants to be a goat?
Questions for GoatVsFish. Before we answer more questions for GoatVsFish, we are speaking to a one. We are speaking to a one. What do they call this one? What do they call this one?
They call this one Jared.
They call this one Jared! They call this one Jared that comes to speak to GoatVsFish. Yes, what are your questions for GoatVsFish? So many questions, this one. Perhaps it sits on the fence.
No, I actually decided that before I got here, that I'm not a fence sitter.
Ah, that is so pleasant verses for GoatVsFish, yes. Are you ready for the one true question? No, perhaps you're not ready for the one true question. We need to hear the verses of GoatVsFish.
Okay.
But you did have one more question for GoatVsFish. GoatVsFish is here to hear the question that you did have for GoatVsFish.
No, I think I'd like to hear more about GoatVsFish before I ask that question.
Excellent verses. Excellent verses. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Ready. Set. Versus. In the beginning, there was goat versus fish. The goat fish. And GoatVsFish said that there should be goat and that there should be fish. There is no alpha or omega. There is no black or white. There is no good or evil. There is only goat and fish. And goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Welcome to the GoatVsFish podcast, recorded at the Comedy Store Los Angeles, a place of GoatVsFish.
Thank you for having me.
Always think goat versus fish. Always think goat versus fish. You have many questions. Yes, you have asked many questions. Yes. Who is goat versus fish? What is goat versus fish? Why is goat versus fish? But there is only one question. Do you know the one true question? Do you know the one true question of goat versus fish?
The question that precedes the question. No, I don't.
Are you goat or are you fish?
I'm goat.
It is a goat! It is a goat! Celebration for goat! We celebrate the goat! We celebrate this goat! We celebrate this goat!
How do we celebrate?
How do we celebrate the goat? How do we celebrate the goat? Well, you are a goat, yes?
Yeah, most definitely.
How do you celebrate goat? How do you celebrate your own goat?
How do I celebrate my own goat?
Yes, you are a goat. Surely you celebrate yourself, goat.
Yeah, I celebrate my goat by understanding my verses, by creating verses.
Ah, you create verses. Ah,
Yeah.
This is splendid. This is splendid,
I
goat
create
versus
verses.
fish.
Well, it's a general rule of you have to create your own verses so somebody else doesn't create your verses for you.
Yes, the ones, the goat, and the fish, they should all create their own verses. Goat
Mhm.
versus fish is simply here to tell you that it is goat versus fish, but the verses come from within you.
Mm-hmm.
What are your verses, goat?
My verses. One of my verses right now is trying to. I've been working on this idea with neurodegenerative disease, and that stems from this verses right here.
Which verses is that you are speaking of now?
That is the football verses.
Ah, the football verses. Yes, the
Yeah.
football verses. This is the same verses as what you're calling the NLF, yes?
Close, yeah, close. I'd like to see what that league consists of, but yeah, the NFL.
Who is this goat? Who is this goat to speak about this what is the verses?
Degenerative.
Neurodegenerative.
Yeah.
What is this goat to speak on it? What is this goat to speak about how it is in some way relation to the NFL verses?
This is a goat that used to be a jaguar, and that used to be, I'm afraid to say it, a fish of Miami.
Ah, you were a Miami fish.
Yes.
And a jaguar. Ah, that is one of the N false versus L. Yes, it is.
Mm-hmm.
So you have experience with this.
So I have
NFL
experience
verses.
being a false versus as well as a true versus.
Ah, you have been on the fence. You have been a fish. Now you are a goat. Yes.
I'd say more than being on the fence, I traversed the fence more than sat on it, because I'm definitely a goat right now. But
Celebration for goat.
yeah, I'm definitely a goat right now, and then before it was the fish of Miami. So I definitely my verses is using my perspective gained from being on each side of the fence, on each side of the verses between goat versus fish, as well as knowing the real verses versus a false verses.
Yes, the real verses versus false verses. Very wise verses, very wise verses.
Hmm.
So to be clearly to all the ones who are hearing, you did play false verses with the NFL. Yes, you did this. For how long was these verses?
Yeah, 7 years I was playing a false verses with the NFL.
Ah! That reminds goat versus fish. That reminds goat versus fish. Usually at the end of the verses, there is a celebration of goat versus fish. But for some verses, goat versus fish is feeling as though there should be a celebration now, even before the verses. Yes, shall we celebrate? Shall we celebrate?
Sure.
Goat versus fish. 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 Goat
versus fish. Goat versus fish. Celebration for goat versus fish.
Those are beautiful verses.
Thank you, yes. Goat versus fish often is hearing that verses before the false verses of the NFL, yes, and yet they are saying different verses with it. What are these verses that are beginning before the false verses of the NFL, yes?
That are beginning before the false verses.
It sounds as the verses that Goat versus Fish was just celebrating, and yet they are not saying Goat versus Fish. They are saying some other verses. Yes, what are those verses?
Oh, you're talking about the national anthem.
Is that what they call it?
Yeah,
yes.
They call it the national anthem. Yeah, that's what they do. They play music, and they get people feeling emotional before a versus, a false versus, that is.
That does sound very Fence-Italy. Very Fence-Italy, yes.
That's what they do. Sorry.
False verses though they may be, Goat vs. Fish has watched the NFL verses and does see much moving about, yes, much use of strength, yes, much use of speed. Well, Goat vs. Fish has tried to comprehend the verses, yes.
Where did you see it? How did you see it? What did you watch it? Where did you watch it?
It was some sort of moving visage, yes. Goat versus Fish is sometimes going to... It is a place where many goat and fish do gather, yes, and they consume a certain sea of the fish that makes them feel very free to verses as they wish. They become loud goat and fish, though some become quiet goat and fish. And there, just behind the ones that were serving the offerings of the sea to the goat and the fish, there was this moving visage, and there it did say the N false versus L. And there were very large ones, such as you, though you are somewhat larger than Goat versus Fish expected. You are somewhat larger than Goat versus Fish expected.
Yeah, where did you gather that information that I was supposed to be smaller than what appeared? Is that from the moving visage?
Are you Pee Wee Herman?
I'm not Pee Wee Herman.
You are not Pee Wee Herman, but you did dance and celebrate as the one that they are calling Pee Wee Herman.
Yeah, I did.
And this is the Comedy Store Los Angeles, so Goat vs. Fish thought perhaps that it was you that was Pee Wee Herman.
No, Goat vs. Fish has that wrong. I only use Pee Wee Herman's dance to celebrate my own achievements in my own verses.
They do seem somewhat humorous verses.
Yeah. I think even though they were false verses, they were still very serious verses. And so I thought that a Pee Wee Herman dance would bring some levity to the serious verses that are even though serious, are false.
Yes, well, it is serious verses. Goat versus Fish, as you know, Goat, is very serious verses. But there is always celebration. There is even some verses for laughing Goat and Fish, yes? Have you always brought this comedic celebration to your serious verses?
No, it started off as a dare. It was a dare more than anything. That we were doing practice verses in Miami, and during those practice verses, there was a wise goat that was teaching all the goat and fish that comprised our team, and incentivized the celebration if we were doing it in the practice verses. And if we were to perform a celebration during the practice verses after a turnover, and
that is when goat becomes fish or fish becomes goat.
Yeah, I was challenged to do that in practice. I did a Pee Wee Herman dance that week because Pee Wee Herman and his big adventure was playing over and over on TV, and it was one of my favorite movies as a kid or as a small goat. And
a kid is a small goat.
Yeah, and so yeah, I was then dared to do it in a game, and I did it in a game, and everybody at the verses seemed to really like the goat doing the Pee Wee dance.
So when you did these false verses, were you goat or were you fish?
Well, I was fish for about 5 years.
You were fish. Now, fish has many verses. Fish has many great verses. Goat versus fish sees great verses in goat, sees great verses in fish. Now you seem somewhat, perhaps, to be finding some unpleasantness, and Goat versus Fish understands there is much unpleasantness in the false verses. But with all the strength and speed and moving about of those verses, when you were a fish, tell us of one of your greatest triumphs over a goat. Remember back to those verses. Remember what splendidness of the verses there was, and recount now, regale Goat versus Fish with one of your greatest triumphs as a fish.
Huh.
You may take your verses.
Oh, thanks, because I don't think I've ever been asked that question.
Perhaps there was a goat, and it was simply Goat versus Fish, and there was triumph for fish.
Yeah, I mean, there was a triumph for the fish and the team of fish that I was on. I remember one of the better weeks of being a Miami Fish was winning against the Seattle Seahawks, and who are obviously not a goat or fish, and so we had to obliterate them. And so we beat them, and I think it was a year that they were really good. And there's there was and I'm not sure what I was doing at the time, but I think there was at those games or at those verses there's a what they call a girlfriend section and a wife section, and so I think I actually had tickets in each of those sections that I was supplying to help people come see the verses. And so it was like, I think it went successful, and there was no drama between the different sections of the stadium to view the verses, and we win, and we went to celebrate. I think you know that word.
Yes.
And then we went to celebrate with all the goat and fish in the Miami universe.
Celebration.
Yeah.
Congratulations on your triumph when you were a fish.
So yeah, that was, but that was an every week thing, and that was kind of, win, lose or draw. You still had the Miami scene to celebrate or walk around in pity after a loss of versus that you still had Miami there to walk around in.
Oh, that is a pleasant place to be.
Yeah, it is a pleasant place to be. You should write that down.
It was written. So this is when you were a fish, you were a dolphin fish?
Yeah, I was a dolphin fish.
Yes, fish. And you were, what was the other one that you did versus?
I eventually was a jaguar.
But when you did triumph as a fish, you did versus. Who was it that you did versus again? It was
Seahawks.
The Seahawks. It is the sea. That is interesting versus, yes. It is the sea. And yet, if you were a fish, then the Seahawks must be goat because it is all goat versus fish. The verses are becoming clear now to goat versus fish. Goat versus fish.
Yeah! Hey! Down! Go! Move your feet! Move your feet! We're not going to get a second chance in the game. Let's go. Let's go, Delta. Delta W. Let's go. Yeah! Yeah! Go! Easy.
Goat versus fish does not know all the ways in which they are versing in the NFL, but Goat versus fish can say this. Goat versus fish sees many classic headbutting verses of goat. Perhaps there is even some headbutting of a fish if you were a fish. Yes, it is very exciting verses, this classic goatly headbutting verses.
Yeah, I think that type of verses is representative of the verses that many goat and fish are absent of in their lives, and I think that's why it's one of the most exciting and invigorating verses there is to watch and be a part of.
And what is the verses you were speaking of? You were speaking of the CTE, yes? That is some verses. You brought it at the beginning of the verses, yes? Perhaps these are important verses to you. For some verses, this is simply occurring to goat versus fish as we are discussing the headbutting verses. Perhaps it comes from within you.
Yeah, do you remember that neurodegenerative disease that I was talking about? That's what I was alluding to when I was talking about CTE. What I plan on doing, what I've been doing, is expanding the definition of that versus, because there seems to be a specific university that is... They've got a narrow versus, which only propagates more verses from a goat like myself. So their verses is a weak versus, and I'm trying to figure out how to expand the verses against neurodegeneration. So naturally, this creates another versus.
How does the neurodegenerative fenciness, it sounds somewhat fancy to goat versus fish, how does it affect a goat that is trying to versus a fish or a fish that is trying to versus a goat?
Well, it affects a goat or fish. I guess I'll guess more than anything, I'll try to explain what the fish of Boston University are proclaiming is that it's the repetitive nature of goat versus fish.
Goat versus fish, goat versus fish, goat versus fish, goat versus fish.
Yes, those repetitive clashes that you're talking about, the headbutts of goat versus goat or goat versus fish, and even fish on fish that end up happening. and I'm not sure how many of these are false verses in your universe of goat versus fish, but the thing is that it's the repetitive verses of goat versus fish
Goat
that
versus fish, goat versus fish, goat versus fish, goat versus fish.
seems to build the neurodegeneration inside the brains of goat and fish.
But one goat and one fish that has the neurodegenerative, are they still able to versus with the full strength of their goat or with the full strength of their fish? How are their verses affected by it?
Yeah, I think, and that's what I'm attempting to do, is to expand the definition of their verses, expand the scope of their verses, because I think a lot of the effects of that repetitive verses only
Goat
is
versus
evident.
fish, goat versus fish, goat versus
I
fish,
was
goat
waiting.
versus fish.
I was waiting. It's only evident in a post-versus landscape.
And are you post-verses? Are you post-verses, posty sounding as offense? But are you after the verses?
Yeah, I'm after the false verses of the NFL, yeah.
Have you been affected? Have you, goat, been affected by the CTE, as you call it?
Yeah, I'd like to believe that I have, but in that,
You would like to believe that
I
you have.
would, because it actually empowers, I think, goat and fish in recognizing that there is more than the definition given by a intellectual fish sitting in their ivory towers, kind of prescribing disease. So I think the thing is that as the goat that I am, recognizing that the neurodegeneration is somewhat inevitable for the position that I played for many years in terms of the repetitive hits. But the thing is that, like, since recognizing that I was GOAT in the post-false verses, I've only become a bigger and stronger GOAT.
Stronger goat to versus fish.
Yeah.
Yes, many triumphs ahead for goat. Yes.
Yeah, I've only become a stronger GOAT. And so the thing is that that I think there are plenty of ways to affect the positive outlooks and motions and abilities of a goat or fish. But I think it actually takes a lot of I hate using the word self-discovery, but I think it takes a certain amount of that in order to empower oneself and not fall prey to a narrative that isn't created by the goat or the goat himself.
So you are saying that there is some very large verses of goat versus fish, that there are some fish that are informing the headbutting goat that their headbutting verses is perhaps not so unpleasant a verses as it may be for the goat in their later verses. And these fish, they are telling false verses to the goat about headbutting verses to see them to be headbutting always exciting verses?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that they're telling them false verses. I think they're telling them narrow verses. But I think that's because these goat that we're dealing with, these repetitive headbutting goats, are susceptible to that because they've been dealing with a narrow versus for a very long time, and that it's only right to then inherit yet again another narrow versus that kind of that provides a narrative for the post headbutting versus in a and gives a versus. Yet again another false verses for these goats.
Another false verses. Oh,
Yeah.
so many false verses.
I think that's the thing that's difficult, is because we end up giving so much credibility to the fish who prescribe these diseases to a lot of people that we end up forgetting that we can empower ourselves as goats and figure out what these fish are saying and empower ourselves.
False verses on the goat. Did say people instead of goat. 5 verses of goat versus fish. Goat versus fish, goat versus fish, goat versus fish, goat versus fish, goat versus fish.
Thank you for redeeming me.
Ah, yes, it is goat versus fish. But you must, if there is to be redeeming, yes, it must be done from yourself. Yes, it was false verses on the goat,
Goat
yes.
versus fish, goat versus fish, goat versus fish, goat versus fish, goat versus fish.
Repeat verses.
So yeah, that's kind of what I'm dealing with, and I think that's what I've been doing is doing a lot of research on the different types of neurodegeneration that are present in the world, and something like Alzheimer's and how that's brought on, and other doctors, scientists, and who are probably fish, but not as fishy, that are developing protocols that actually help combat and reverse neurodegeneration.
Reverses, yes.
There is more that you can do for yourself in a post-career or post-versus landscape.
Now, you have spoken of some of the narrow verses, yes, but what are your verses? Are you prepared to say here with GoatVsFish what you have found, what you know, or what you claim to know, what you see of these verses? Yes, now you can tell all the ones who listen to GoatVsFish. What are your verses?
Yeah, this goat has found that in my new verses is like I said, expanding the idea of how one goat brings on neurodegeneration, and that there's it's through diet, it's through sleep, it's through understanding how stress and cortisol works, which is a stress hormone, and how that all affects inflammation in your body and in your brain and in your gut. That essentially affects the building of tau protein in your brain, which is said to be the basis of CTE, which is building of tau protein and tau lesions inside the brain from impact, which is one thing that is covered in my research or the reading that I've been doing in terms of Alzheimer's, and that you can bring on neurodegeneration like Alzheimer's through 3 different ways, which is through inflammation, which is through trophic factors, which is the lack of nutrients or imbalance of hormones, and then a third way, which is through toxicity.
Sounds very fancy. It is always the fence that is getting in the way of the verses.
Yeah, but I think sometimes you need to sit on the fence to be able to recognize what your versus is, so you can jump into your versus full head of steam.
Oh, GoatVsFish. Explain this to GoatVsFish. Some goat and fish claim to GoatVsFish that they must sit on the fence so that they can be part of GoatVsFish. But if you are sitting on the fence not choosing goat or fish, then you are a fence sitter. How is it that sitting on the fence can be to the verses of GoatVsFish?
Because when you're not in battle, then you're able to actually see the battle. When you can remove yourself from the constant swirl of verses, you can then decide how to enter the verses and mitigate your risk of pain and I guess methodically approach the verses, which is different than the combative headbutting of the verses. So that's why you need to sit on the fence. You need to sit on the fence to be able to create a game plan in order to take part in the verses.
If it can make more GoatVsFish, if it can make more exciting verses and longer verses to have some fence sitting between the verses. GoatVsFish, 2 fence Italy for GoatVsFish. Choose goats, choose fish, GoatVsFish. Now, you have also been engaged in GoatVsFish, some sort of charitable verses, and you have also some artistic verses, yes? You have done so many verses that are beyond the false verses of the NFL, yes?
Yeah, I'm involving myself with different aspects and different verses outside the false verses of the NFL. Yeah, there's a couple things I've written. There's a couple things I've consulted in terms of writing with shows out here like Ballers, and then I guess there's different artistic endeavors I've appreciated. And I was like, in this summer I was in Brooklyn. I was helping a friend manage an art gallery in Brooklyn, and that was an interesting versus.
What could be more appreciated than a beautiful visage of GoatVsFish? For all to see, yes.
Mm-hmm.
You are with GoatVsFish, yes?
Yes.
You are absorbing GoatVsFish. You are hearing GoatVsFish.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps in some future verses you could curate GoatVsFish.
Perhaps I could, yeah, but I think I need to know more about GoatVsFish and GoatVsFish's lineage in order for me to be able to represent and curate GoatVsFish properly.
In the beginning, there was GoatVsFish. Now, this may seem like tedious verses, but you are here Goat versus Fish is trying to know that when they are saying Panthers versus Steelers, if it is Goat versus Fish, if it is two goat that are attempting a versus so that they can later engage in the one true versus of Goat versus Fish. So, let us hear about all these ones that are engaged in what appear to be false verses, what are false verses, but perhaps if we can reveal they are Goat versus Fish, then they are Goat versus Fish. This is Goat or Fish. Goat versus Fish will present a versus to you, and you simply say if it is goat. If it is fish, let us begin the verses of goat or fish. Cardinals, goat or fish.
Fish.
Falcons, goat or fish.
Fish.
Ravens.
Fish.
Bills.
Goat.
Panthers.
Goat.
Bears.
Goat.
Ha! Bears are goat. Bears are goat. Bengals.
Goat.
Browns.
That's goat.
Ah, that is goat. It is a brown goat. Cowboys.
Yeah, it's definitely goat.
Definitely goat. Broncos.
Goat.
Lions.
Goat.
Packers.
Fish.
Fish. Packing fish. Packing fish. Texans.
Goat.
Colts.
Goat.
You have spoken of the Jaguars. You have spoken of the Jaguars. They seem to sit on the fence, but Jaguars?
Goat.
Goat. They are goat. They are goat. Chiefs.
Fish.
Fish. Yes, the Miami Dolphins are fish. You have said they are fish. Confirming fish.
Fish. Confirmed.
Vikings.
Oh, that's goat.
That is goat. That is goat.
I don't know. I think those are fence sitters.
Why is this one on the fence when so many of the other ones you know are goat or fish?
Because they've got the beard of a goat, but the navigation of the sea like a fish.
Fence sitter. Fence sitter, Viking fence sitter.
Yeah, they're a fence sitter.
Patriots, goat or fish?
Goat.
Goat. Saints, goat or fish?
Yeah, they're a fence sitter too.
Fence sitter as well. Why do they sit on the fence?
Because I don't think they make a decision to be anything.
Giants, goat or fish?
I'd say goat.
Goat? You would say giant goat? Giant goat.
Mm-hmm.
Beware, fish. It is a giant goat. Jets, goat or fish?
Fence sitter.
Fence sitter, another fence sitter. Raiders, goat or fish?
They are goat.
They are goat. Raiding goat.
Actually, you know
goat.
what? They might be like the Vikings. I think they're like the Vikings. They're definitely like the Vikings. They're fence sitters.
Fence sitters, fence sitters.
Yes.
Eagles, goat or fish?
Fish.
Fish. Steelers.
Yeah, they're fence sitters too.
Fence sitters as well. Oh, it is becoming all fancy, all of the verses. All of the verses. Yes, why do they sit on the fence?
Because I don't think they actually. I don't think there's no delineation of being able to be a fish or a goat there.
Fence sitters.
Yeah.
Rams, goat or fish?
Come on now, they're goats.
Yes, of course they are goat. Goat versus fish. Knew they had to be goat. Look at the horn of the goat. Why do they call themselves a ram when they are so clearly goat? Chargers, goat or fish?
They're fence sitters too.
Fence sitter.
Yeah.
49ers, goat or fish?
I'd say goat.
Goat. You have said that the Seahawks are goat. Yes, Seahawks are goat.
Did I say that they're goats?
Goat versus fish. It is written that the Seahawks are goat. Yes, do you wish to change your verses?
When did I say that they were goats in the first place?
Perhaps it is you are not remembering because of what you were discussing of the neurodegenerative verses that you did speak of.
Wow.
Perhaps it is so. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish does not know. They are goat because you said that when you were a fish, your greatest triumph was over the ones called a Seahawks. So goat versus fish. If you were a fish, then surely it was goat versus fish.
Yeah, goat versus fish would assume that.
Yes, it would be goat versus fish. But now you say they are fish.
They're definitely fish.
So you say your greatest triumph as a fish was when you were versus a fish?
Yes.
NFL, what is with your false versus putting fish against fish? Triumphs of fish against fish when it should be goat versus fish.
But that would be a true versus in a kingdom of false verses in the first place. So it's like a true versus because
a fish and a fish is true verses?
It's true verses in a world of false verses. It would only be a false verse if it was a true verses inside a world of false verses.
That is fanciness on the goat. Fanciness on the goat. Buck and ears. Goat or fish?
They're fence sitters too, just like the Raiders and just like the Vikings.
Titans, goat or fish?
Goat.
And Redskins, goat or fish?
Goat.
Goat. You say they are goat. Now, goat versus fish has heard these verses from so many goat and fish. But at long verses, though goat versus fish cannot ask it itself, goat versus fish can at least ask you, goat. Is Tom Brady goat? Is Tom Brady the goat? So many claim it is the goat. Is it goat or is it fish, Tom Brady?
When we're comparing him to goats of his kind, yes. Yeah, he's definitely the goat.
But is Tom Brady goat or is Tom Brady fish?
He's goat.
It is goat. It is goat. The goat says it is goat.
How do you know Tom Brady?
Goat versus fish has heard the one speaking of it.
Who are the ones?
So many goat and fish. There is one that it was called Mark the Shark Stevens. Yes, it is a comedian fish.
Okay.
It is a comedian shark fish, and it is always speaking of the New England Patriot that you say is a goat, and it is always celebrating that goat, and it is saying, "Oh, Tom Brady's a goat. Tom Brady's a goat." So goat versus fish has heard of this one. Yes.
This one that celebrates Tom Brady as a goat, is he also a goat?
That one is a fish.
He's a fish.
Yes, it is a shark. It is Mark the Shark Stevens fish. And it does even say, though it is a proud fish, it suspects that it could not even triumph over the goat that is Tom Brady. That is what this fish claims.
Well, what good is that fish?
There is no good or evil. There is only goat and fish. There is only goat and fish. What do you say to the goat?
What do I say to all goats? Are we talking all goats? Ask good questions. That's what it is. Ask quality questions.
That's a versus.
Yeah.
What do you say to the fish?
Ask better questions.
What do you say to the fence sitter?
Ask a question.
What do you say to goat versus fish?
How long can you do this?
It is forever goat versus fish. It is forever goat versus fish. Now, if the ones wish to communicate with you, how would they find you to send you a messaging about this verses of the NFL or the CTE or any verses? How do they communicate with this goat?
Probably the best way is if there is any social media, it's going to be Instagram, which is MaxBear75. That's MaxBaer75. Trying to get that 75 changed, but it's hard to do that. It's hard to get out of the game. You know, you have to contact some type of social media support team or staff to be able to change who you are. It's almost like, you know, trying to change your legal name. Once you get a blue check mark next to it, it's tough to change it.
That is not how it is with goat versus fish. If you wish to become a fish, you can simply say you are fish and you will become that fish. To goat versus fish.
Oh, okay.
Are you goat or fish?
Goat.
Goat. You should change it to Max Bear Goat. Says goat versus fish.
Says goat versus fish, but being the goat that I am, I'm the goat that is currently Max Bear 75, and I can't do anything to change that right now.
Thank you for being a part of Goat vs. Fish.
Man, that's it? Thank you for having me.
Always thank Goat vs. Fish. Always thank Goat vs. Fish.
How many Goat versus Fish does that deserve for me not saying thank you to Goat versus Fish?
10 Goat vs. Fish on the Goat.
Goat versus Fish. 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 Goat versus Fish.
Goat vs. Fish! Thank you for joining Goat vs. Fish. These are the verses of Goat vs. Fish. Subscribe, rate, and review the Goat vs. Fish podcast on the YouTube and the iTunes. Follow Goat vs. Fish on all social media. On the Instagram, on the Twitterverse, on the Book of Faces, all at Goat vs. Fish, all at GoatVsFish. And if you wish to witness a live versus of Goat vs. Fish at one of the comedy places or conventions, go to GoatVsFish.com to find places and times of all future verses. The theme celebration for this versus was an offering by McHenry on SoundCloud, a fish. And if you, one who listens, has a celebration of Goat vs. Fish in song or poem, or perhaps a question for Goat vs. Fish, do send it to GoatVsFish@gmail.com. Join the Goat vs. Fish discussion group on the Book of Faces to discuss Goat vs. Fish with other goat and fish. And when you are out in the land and the sea, look about you. Look about you! Find one who is lost. Find one who does not know the way. And ask. Simply ask, are you goat or are you fish? Thank you for joining Goat vs. Fish. I am Goat vs. Fish, the Goat Fish. Now, will you say with Goat vs. Fish for the final verses, this is simply for adding to the later verses. Together we say, Goat vs. Fish.
Give me the proper Goat versus Fish, and I'll say Goat versus Fish.
Yes, Goat versus Fish.
Goat versus Fish.
Once more for the verses.
Okay.
How do you wish to say it, yes?
Oh, well, that should be upon the Goat versus Fish.
Yes, it shall be Goat versus Fish.
Okay.
Goat versus Fish. And now together we say, are you goat? Yes, you have said Goat versus Fish.
Yeah.
And thank you for saying to Goat versus Fish that you should repeat Goat versus Fish, because in all verses, Goat versus Fish did not see that you were being somewhat fancy, but you are an honest goat to Goat versus Fish. Now we say together as one, we say, are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or are you fish? Yes, and now together we say, to close the verses, we say, and it was written, and it was written. And it was written, and it was written.
That's a false verses.
It is false verses. You are saying it was written is false verses.
Yes, it's false
it
verses.
was written false verses. Oh, fanciness, fanciness, fanciness on the goat, fanciness on the goat. Goat versus fish. And it was written, 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 and it was written. Why do you say it is false verses?
Because there is no verses, and there is no goat, and there is no fish.
Fancy verses! Oh, it seems that the false verses of the NFL have not completely left this goat. Oh, goat versus fish. Goat versus fish!